Good morning. Good morning and welcome to the ICPVTR webinar on perspectives on identity-based extremism in the Indo-Pacific. I'm Dr. Iram Halim, Assistant Professor of Strategic Studies at RSIS at NTU, and I'll be the moderator for today's webinar. Today we have three speakers who have published extensively in their respective areas. Dr. Kumar Ramakrishna, Professor Siam Takwani, and Dr. Sam Mullins. Each speaker will have about 15 to 20 minutes to talk, after which you'll have the opportunity to ask questions via the text feature in the Zoom that we have. Please do keep your questions brief so I can address them and address them to the speakers. Dr. Kumar Ramakrishna is Associate Professor, Associate Dean, Research Advisor to National Security Studies Program, and head of the International Center for Political Violence and Terrorism Research at Rajaratnam School of International Studies at NTU. He has published numerous internationally refereed journals and co-edited two well-received books on counterterrorism. He is also the author of numerous single-authored books, including Singapore Chronicles Emergency, published in 2016. Dr. Ramakrishna will be speaking on Buddhist extremism in Myanmar. Dr. Ramakrishna, over to you, please.
Thanks, Iram. Let me just share my screen. Okay, I hope you guys can see this, Iram. Yep. Okay, thanks very much. Hi, everyone. It's good to be here this morning to share some personal views on this topic, which I think would be of interest to many of you, Buddhist extremism in Myanmar. Some preliminary musings. So the aims of my intervention this morning would be to examine the specific phenomenon of Buddhist extremism in Myanmar through a wider theoretical lens of religious extremism. And when I talk about religious extremism here, I'm going to explain that I see it as an acute form of religious fundamentalism. I'll explain. The other thing I want to do in my intervention is to suggest 7 key characteristics of the religious extremists, which is relevant not just for the specific case of Buddhist extremism in Myanmar, but I would suggest perhaps across the board, perhaps even in other types of religious extremism as well. And ultimately, I want to show that the religious extremist violence we are talking about is, we should think of it as structural, i.e. it's not just violence in terms of physical harm, but it can be systemic and indirect as well and built into the structure of the society. So this is something we should be aware of. So some caveats quickly. This research is actually part of a bigger project which is aimed at employing a multi-perspectival or multidisciplinary approach to figure out how different faiths can evince extremist manifestations. So the eventual objective is to develop a robust theoretical framework for understanding religious extremism per se, and which can cover different faiths and different regions. So this is why I was hoping to sort of like engage in this conversation this morning with my colleagues from DKI APCSS. So welcome your feedback. As I mentioned, this talk represents preliminary musings. So let's get into it. Buddhist extremism in Myanmar, a snapshot. So big background, Buddhists form about 88% of the Myanmar population of 53 million. Muslims form only 4%. Myanmar has more than 100 ethnic groups, so it's a very diverse country. Of interest to us, between June and October 2012, a few hundred Muslims were killed in Buddhist Muslim riots in the Western Arakan region of Myanmar, and 110,000 Rohingya were displaced. There was renewed anti-Rohingya violence by Myanmar military in 2017. More than 700,000 refugees fled to Bangladesh, and they are not returning. So currently, by some estimates this year, about 900,000 Rohingya refugees are now in Bangladesh, 100,000 in Malaysia. There are some as well in Indonesia as well. So anti-Muslim intolerance in Myanmar has actually extended beyond just the Rohingyas and has also grown in Myanmar fanned by Buddhist extremism. So let's talk about religious extremism. As I mentioned, I see religious extremism as an acute form of fundamentalism. Let's think about that. Let's unpack this. Fundamentalism has been studied in great detail. In fact, well-known study in the 1980s was the University of Chicago's Fundamentalism Project. So religious fundamentalism can be understood as an embattled form of spirituality in which the fundamentalist believers feel that they are under siege from secular modernity, but also competing faith groups. So that's why other scholars have talked about fundamentalism is a form of religion which feels under threat. So that's important to keep in mind, not just for the Buddhist extremists in Myanmar, but also I would suggest for the Hindus in India as well. Religious fundamentalism is, in other words, also tradition made self-aware and on the defensive. So this is why I suggest that we can think usefully about religious extremism as a fundamentalist belief system that legitimize structural violence against relevant outgroups. So this is important. What is structural violence? This is not a new idea, right? A couple of years ago, J.M. Berger, in a very useful book on extremism, made the important point that extremist hostile action against outgroups it's more than just physical violence, you know. It also includes non-physical types of harm, like verbal attacks, and as he said, diminishment to also discriminatory behavior. But many years ago, Johann Galtung, in a very well-known paper, talked about a broader definition of violence. So he was saying that violence is present and human beings are influenced so that basically they are not able to fulfill their full potentials, right? Their mental potentials, their physical potentials, right? So Galtung said very interestingly, and I quote from him, there is violence that works on the body, which is physical harm, as well as violence that works on the soul, where the latter would include lies, brainwashing, indoctrination, various kinds of threats that serve to decrease individuals' potentialities. And Galtung's important point was violence can be built into the structure and it can show up as unequal power and consequently as unequal life chances. So the point is, violence is not just physical. It can be built into the structure. So what then I would suggest 7 key characteristics of the religious fundamentalist extremists. Well, first, this extremist would display a very emotional, very fanatical attachment to his own belief system. Although his belief system may be a minority belief system in that society, but because he focuses so much on it, he wants it to be recognized as the main belief system. And this would be in disregard of recognized international norms or even the wider national, constitutional, ideological, or even mainstream theological currents. So this is a form of identity supremacism. So that is one key characteristic of the fundamentalist extremists, identity extremism, identity supremacism. Second, the extremist is dogmatically committed to the idea that his in-group, his religious in-group is morally superior to the out-group. So this is in-group bias. Thirdly, the extremist is committed to the idea that the out-group is evil, and in fact is an existential threat to the in-group. Fourth, there is a strong fixation, even obsession with purity. Don't mingle with the out-group, right? Fifth, there is a low integrity complexity that means that it's a very simplistic worldview. That you're either with us or against us. It's very black and white thinking. The extremist is unable or unwilling to, to sort of like answer the question of, are there different perspectives? He says, no, there's only one correct perspective, right? So it's very binary worldview. 6, there is a tendency to engage in dangerous speech towards outgroup members, right? And dangerous speech, right, can be of 2 types. And this is, I would think, is quite important. So in the hard mode of dangerous speech, the extremists will basically say, go out and kill the other people, or go out and hurt the other outgroup members, right? So there's direct incitement. But there's also the more subtle soft mode, where the rhetoric used is discriminatory and dehumanizing, but there is no explicit outright call to violence because the extremist does not want to fall afoul of national laws. So my point is the extremist can shift between the soft and hard modes of dangerous speech depending on his tactical appreciation of the situation. So it's what some scholars like Botticher said, just because an extremist doesn't call for violent action doesn't mean that, he's non-violent on principle. It's just he's non-violent because of tactical appreciation, circumstances, and opportunities. If he had the opportunity, he would become violent. the seventh characteristic is the extremist, more than focus on religious piety, he wants to have power. He wants to actively seek power to restructure society according to his preferred version of what the right society should be. So I suggest that, it's not nice to call people extremists or call groups extremists. In my research, I suggested that if an individual or a group evinces several, but not all of these seven characteristics, he would have an extreme orientation, right? But if all seven characteristics are present to me, I would think that we are dealing with a religious extremist. So when looking at Myanmar, let's look at the Myanmar situation, applying the framework. What do we see? I think that we can see Buddhist extremism manifested in identity supremacism. Summarizing a lot of history here, there were actually many centuries of relative religious harmony, right, in the country, but the anti-colonial Burma or Burman nationalist movement that emerged by the 1930s was animated by ethnic religious chauvinism towards non-Burma and non-Buddhist minorities. And as Francis Wade said recently in his book, this tendency persisted all the way until the current time. Now, in 2008, the Myanmar constitution stipulated the special position of Buddhism as the faith professed by the great majority of citizens, but that was section 361. But section 362 also mentioned that the other faiths have followers in the country as well. Moreover, the current NLD government, which came to power in 2016, a year later, ratified the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. So basically, at least there is this official recognition that all the various religious groups should have economic and social rights, right? But the Myanmar military essentially still holds a lot of power, and their ideological orientation is that there is a very important need to maintain the purity and the homogeneity of the Buddhist Burma majority. And in fact, this idea of keeping the majority group protected, their purity and homogeneity protected, is something you also see in other forms of extremism, as we shall see as well. And the Muslims at that time were seen as a key threat. And this is where a very key figure in Buddhist extremism in Myanmar comes in, Ashin Veratu. He was a leading figure in the Buddhist fundamentalist 969 movement, and later 969 kind of morphed into the Mabata, which is the Association for the Protection of Race and Religion. And Mabata spearheaded the movement to defend Buddhism from the Muslim threat. So Viratu and his colleagues have significant grassroots support who buy into the narrative that inherently peaceful and non-proselytizing Buddhism is under threat from an aggressive faith, in this particular case, Islam. So the narrative is Buddhism must remain supreme in Myanmar, is under threat. And this is an example of the extremist narrative in Myanmar. Over the course of decades, Muslim Rohingya came over the border from Bangladesh and settled on Rakhine land, which is Arakan in the western Myanmar. They grew in number and diluted the Buddhist population, forming a crusade to turn Myanmar into a Muslim country. Therefore, unlike other Muslims in Myanmar, such as there are other non-Rohingya Muslims, the Rohingya in particular have never been Burmese citizens. So this is the narrative. However, this Buddhist extremist anti-Muslim narrative has gone beyond the Rohingya to target Myanmar's other Muslims as well. We can also see, apart from identity supremacism, we can also see in-group bias. In this particular colleague, gentleman, a colleague of Viratu, has said that in Buddhist teaching, it is taught that you cannot harm other people. Hence, a person who actually does harm other people, he can't be Buddhist, right? And also he has said whether or not the people who say they are Buddhists attack Muslims, maybe they're not real Buddhists, or they only temporarily follow Buddhists, or maybe they were not even Buddhists at all. So, and in fact, this guy was saying that if there's no Buddhism, there will be more violence, right? So there's this sense that in his particular religious group, they can do no wrong. They can do no wrong. At the same time, there's complementing the in-group bias, you have out-group prejudice. So Viratu in particular have been saying that Muslims have been saying very bad things about the Muslim, particularly Rohingyas, right? They're saying that they have been destroying Buddhist and Buddhism symbols. He even claimed that there's a 100-year plan to take over Myanmar's sovereignty through interfaith marriages with Buddhists. And his other colleagues have said that Muslims have been trained since they are young in the mosque about extreme ideas such as to dominate the whole world. And most of them are touched in this way. So it's very sweeping statements, out-group prejudice. So in fact, there's some evidence of mainstreaming of such prejudices amongst ordinary Burmas. The fourth characteristic, Buddhist extremism in Myanmar, obsession with purity and fear of contamination. Basically, Viratu has been known to sort of call on the Buddhists to stay away from Muslims, don't buy from their businesses, right? Only buy from Buddhist-owned businesses. And as Francis Wade has put it quite well, he basically wants to solidify the religious divide. He wants to make it clear, us and them, we are good, they are evil, stay away from them. And there's some mainstreaming of intolerant ideas. For example, Francis Wade interviewed a young Buddhist, and he said that, he no longer interacted with the Muslim population because he thinks that they are stupid, their religion is bad. And, he had Rohingya friends, and although this guy said that, although his former friend is not a bad person, but, his whole group is bad, so this is the idea of, don't stay away from them, don't mix with the out group. Now, the dualistic thinking is also there, frankly. There's a very simple narrative which the Buddhist extremists push forth in Myanmar. I mean, it's very simple, easy to understand, right? They will say that, for example, 90% of Muslims in the country are bad people, they are doing all these things, they want to destroy our religion, and so, it's like as if people like Viratu are trying to eliminate the middle ground, to divide the world into the safe and good part of the community and the bad and evil part. So it's very us and them thinking. So as what again Francis Wade has said, it's a very simple narrative that links everything together, the fate of Buddhism to the fate of the nation and the fate of the individual. So there is a threat out there, the great Muslim threat, and Buddhists need to come together, unify against that threat. And the dangerous speech is also there. I would say that, for example, Viratu, right, he has described Muslims very strongly, in very strong terms, as all those things, right, very dehumanizing speech, but he's been very careful to avoid hard mode. Now, that means he has often said that he has never encouraged attacks, and nowhere in his sermons does he implore his followers to take up the sword. Though many observers have said that, but the kind of things he says certainly creates a climate of intolerance that can, in other certain circumstances, catch fire. So that's why there's an American NGO, Justice Trust, that actually pointed out that outbreaks of violence often coincide with Viratu speeches or posts on the 969 Facebook page. And in fact, when journalists who have interviewed him say that, how come you are saying all these things, but then he will say things like, well, look at me, I'm quite okay, I don't have any hatred at all. So if you look at for example, Islamist extremists in Southeast Asia, which I've studied, they have a similar attitude. They will say these things in public, they will create a climate of intolerance, but then they will say that, well, but I'm not doing anything. I didn't call anybody to beat anybody up. So we shouldn't be taken in. And the seventh characteristic, the quest for political power to impose structural violence on our groups can be actually seen in the country as well. Several years ago, the previous government passed a population control law that essentially seeks to implement population control measures in certain areas, and observers say that it's targeted at the Muslim majority in the northern Rakhine state. There's a Buddhist women's special marriage law that puts several administrative strictures in place. So it's not straightforward for a Buddhist woman to marry a non-Buddhist man. Religious conversion law imposes regulations on Buddhists wanting to convert to other religions. And finally, the monogamy law makes it a criminal offense, among other things, to have more than one spouse, right? So offenders are liable to up to imprisonment. So the International Crisis Group put it in 2017 that they even observed and said, right, publicly, that the constitutional provisions on religious freedom and non-discrimination appear to have discriminatory intent and to be targeted at the Muslim community in that country. So in fact, last year, Viratu ran afoul of the national laws. He was charged under sedition legislation for his comments against the NLD government, but he just only recently surrendered to the Myanmar authorities, right? So this is the current situation. So what are the implications that I'm ending now? Basic point is Buddhist extremism in Myanmar is not sui generis. It is an example of religious extremism, an acute form of fundamentalism, i.e. religion that perceives itself under siege. I would say that, especially when you listen to other colleagues today, there are similarities between Buddhist extremism and other types of religious extremism, such as Islamist and perhaps Hindu extremism. To me, if an individual or organizational entity possesses all 7 characteristics of religious extremism, then I would say that extremism exists. But if there are less than 7, like 1 or 2, I mean, I wouldn't. I think it's quite a big thing to sort of consider an entity as extremist. But if there are only 2, say 1 or 2 out of 7, I mean, I would say extreme orientation is probably a more proper and reasonable analysis. And I think important point here, I would like to emphasize, a religious extremist dangerous speech can manifest in either the soft mode or hard mode. So, that's why extremism, the violence is arguably latent. Extremists are not dumb. They will not try to go out of their way to get arrested by directly inciting violence against outgroups. I mean, they will try to stay within the law, right? But they will definitely try to create a intolerant attitude towards outgroups. So the soft mode is something that should be taken note of. And ultimately, extremist violence is structural. We should not just look at the violent manifestations of physical harm against outgroups, because it can be also built into the structure. It can be systemic and indirect as well. So with that, that's the end of my presentation. Look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Ramakrishna. So we now move on to our next speaker, Professor Shyam Takwani, who is professor at the Daniel K. Inouye Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies in Hawaii, where he specializes in political violence, security dynamics of South Asia, terrorism and counterterrorism, and the role of media and security. Professor Takwani's extensive background as a journalist, reporting on conflict and insurgency in the Indo-Asia Pacific context, including his extensive coverage of the ethnic conflict in Sri Lanka, is notable. Professor Takwani has lectured widely at universities and institutions in several countries, including a decade at NTU here in Singapore. Professor Takwani will speak on Hindu extremism. So over to you, Professor Takwani.
Thank you, Erin. And good morning, everybody. Right. Now, my story begins with Hindu extremism. My story begins way back in the early 20th century. And this is a quick snapshot of the religions that are dominant in South Asia. As you can see, Hinduism tops the list at 64%, and Islam is about 29%. If you translate those numbers to the Indian subcontinent, it was probably the subcontinent with the largest number of Muslims in the world, until the British divided it in 1947 based on religion. So you had the Hindus who decided to keep India for themselves, and to be frank, they ejected the Muslims out to what became Pakistan. So currently, as we speak, India has almost got 14% of Muslims in a population of 1.7 billion. We're looking at about 200 million Muslims. Now, I must thank Dr. Ramakrishna for his theoretical framework because it fits like nothing else I've seen onto this case study that I'm presenting here on India. And I know he referred to 7 characteristics of religious extremists, but I think if you look at the case of India, you'll probably find 3 additional characteristics, and you could escalate the number to 10. But let me start here. This goes back to about 1925, before the country became independent. This is an organization called the Rashtriya Swayam Sangh, the RSS, which is essentially, if you translate it, it's a national volunteer organization or a national volunteer corps It was established in 1925. That's about 22 years before the partition of the subcontinent. And it drew great inspiration, matter of fact, based on one-on-one contact with Benito Mussolini in Italy when he set up the fascist movement. One of the Hindu leaders came back and decided to set up something similar like the fascist organization, and thus was born the RSS. It's right-wing, it's Hindu nationalist, and it's a paramilitary, as I said again, a volunteer organization. Now, what was its main task, even in 1925? Its idea was simple, that India belonged to the Hindus, and thus came the name Hindustan to a large extent. Just bear in mind, India, as we know India today, was not one integrated country in that period of time. You had multiple kingdoms, matter of fact, over 555 kingdoms, and each of them practicing their own form of, their own strain of Hinduism, their own strain of Islam for that matter. And so the idea here was to integrate the whole geographical entity into one Hindu nation. Sorry. Okay. Well, let's go back to, let's jump again to the 1940s. 1948, the father of the nation, Mahatma Gandhi, he was assassinated. And who assassinated him? It wasn't a disgruntled Muslim. It was a disgruntled Hindu who came from this organization, the RSS that I just referred to. Now, what was his problem? His problem was Gandhi was trying to unify the country. Gandhi was trying basically to make sure that the Muslim was not treated any different from the Hindu on the subcontinent. And for the RSS, for the Hindu fanatics, the extremists, this was sacrilegious. They couldn't tolerate this kind of blasphemous behavior. And they saw Gandhi as someone, as a stumbling block to their plan, the intent of a larger Hindu nation. So he was assassinated. And that's his assassin on the right there, Nathuram Godse. Just as an aside, I should just mention here, Godse was hung after he was found guilty. And he was a active member of the RSS, though at that point in time, the RSS made all kinds of excuses saying he's a former member, no longer a member, but later evidence has shown that he was a member of the RSS. He was hung. This was in 1949. But let me just bring to your attention, India today, as we see it in the last, let's say 5-6 years, Godse is being resurrected as a hero of the Indian national movement. Not that anybody is saying Gandhi was a villain, but that is implicit. The point is, there are shrines and statues being built in honor of Godse in today's India as we speak. All right, so this, after Gandhi's assassination, India's witnessed a number of communal riots, between Hindus and Muslims over the years from 1948, I'd say maybe up to 2014. And these were sporadic events. These were usually generated, incited by political parties, and they saw basically the Muslims as a vote bank. The point is, a large number of these riots were instigated by some branch of the RSS. Remember that the RSS wasn't static all these years. It was evolving. It was an organic, dynamic organization. It had formidable and still has formidable organizational ability and membership, growing membership. So the RSS has never been a static organization. It always sought to acquire political power in the country to reshape the country in their image. Now, having said that, I should also draw your attention to the fact in the Hindu extremist is essentially, he cannot be a religious extremist. And that's simply because Hinduism is very plural. They don't have a single sacred text which adherents can swear by. It's just the idea of civilization, culture, and race that makes an Hindu an extremist. The religious aspect is basically an icing on the cake, but the real drive is it's all civilizational, race, and culture. So this is a structure, and it's called the Sangh Parivar. The Sangh Parivar basically is a Sangh family, which is the Hindu Hindutva family. And I'm just giving you a very bare bones skeletal structure. As you can see on the headline there, it says, and the US equivalents. I could give you a similar chart with the UK equivalents. The point being, it's spread over the world. And it's got branches all over the world. If you look at even the recent elections in the United States, there was so much of commentary going on about how able and how important would the Hindu votes be for the elections here. Just by way of saying that they're deeply entrenched and they are spreading. I mean, the idea is to have a Hindu India, but it's also to reach out to the international community and the Hindus overseas to make sure, at least if not buying into the idea entirely, to be donors for this. So if you look at the chart, the RSS is the mothership, and beneath that, you have the militant wing, the Bajrang Dal lower down. You have the BJP, which is a political wing and which is a ruling party of the country today as we speak. This is just to give you an idea of what Hindu unity they're talking about. Essentially target the Muslims, essentially target the Jews. I'm sorry, not the Jews, and the secular Indian. Now, when I speak about the secular Indian as defined by the Constitution way back in 1940, 1950, when it was written, India was a pluralistic country. All cultures, race, religions were all equal. For the Hindu fanatic today, the secular Indian is as evil as a Muslim Indian. So the point is, you can see the appeal that they're making. This is an Islamophobic pamphlet, but the later pamphlets also include the word secular enemies. So let's come to 2014, when we had the elections, and for the first time, the Hindu party acquired power on its own. And it was a soccer of a majority. It was a huge majority. And thus was born this, this concept. The entire project Hindutva started taking shape. Let me go back a little to 1992, when Hindu mobs tore down a 16th century mosque in the north of India. And on what basis? The basis was this, that one of the Hindu gods was born on that particular location where the Mughals had set up a mosque. So the mosque was destroyed, went into contention at the courts. The courts ruled in favor to a large extent of the Hindus. And now there's a temple being built on that very spot where a mosque stood for a very long time. So here you have the incoming Prime Minister of India, who's basically saying, if you're a patriot, you got to be a Hindu nationalist. If you aren't, then you're not a patriot. And if you're not a patriot, you have no space in this country. Now, this concept of Hindutva is different from Hindu. Hindu is what we call as religion. The Hindutva is basically a political ideology. It's not a religion. It's a political ideology, essentially to recast the country as a Hindu nation. This gentleman, of course, had a very long history of communal violence in the state that he ruled in Gujarat way back in 2000, 2002. And today, as you can see, since 2014 and 2019, when he returned to power, even with a greater majority than 2014, you see the country being polarized along the lines of Hinduism. So this is the Brotherhood in saffron. Saffron is their color, basically. And I'm just going to throw in, for want of time, a couple of examples. We have seen systematic, targeted attacks against the minorities. And when I say minorities, there are several kinds. There's a Muslim minority, there's the caste system where you have the castes of the minorities, and given the kind of votes he got for the election in his rise to power, anybody who opposes him, and which is a secular kind of Indian, that's also a minority. So just quick snapshots of how the Hindutva movement is panning out. There is direct violence, but more importantly, the structural violence. Dr. Ramakrishna mentioned where the leader is basically using very inflammatory language to incite the crowds, incite mobs, and he, at the same time, he's denying it, that he's responsible for the violence. In India, you have both kinds. You have direct incitement, where direct force, physical force is used, a lynching of Muslims, lynching of cattle traders who are basically Muslims, as an example, the rape of lower caste women. What differentiates the scene here in India from the rest of the world, I would say, where you're seeing a growth of nationalism based on religion or religious tenets, is the tacit approval by the state in India. It's tacit. In some cases, in provinces, it's not tacit. It's outright and direct. Go do it. And the fact that more and more people are tending towards this kind of violence is because there's an atmosphere, an environment of impunity. You can do it and get away with it. We don't have any instances of courts prosecuting or even indicting people who have been caught red-handed or even on video footage, which they circulate after committing such a heinous act of being prosecuted or jailed. So you have this word, the Hindu Taliban. So what is exactly part of the Hindutva agenda? We're going back to how India was in the past, a pure form of India. Now, that's utter rubbish. Most of us know that. The pure form of India is more perceived, more imaginary. And what does that entail? If you ask, there should be arranged marriages. Girls can't have freedom. They shouldn't be wearing jeans. They shouldn't be going to pubs. They shouldn't be carrying mobile phones. And I'm giving you extreme examples from different parts of India. When we speak of India, remember, there are 29 provinces. Each province is almost like a different country. But there are certain characteristics that run similar. And you'll find these traits are more pronounced in the northern part of the country than the rest of the country. So this is an example of what happened in one part of India when they were decided to celebrate Valentine's Day. So you can't celebrate Valentine's Day because you have Hindu mobs and thugs going out to ensure that there's a violent reaction to anybody who decides to spend Valentine's Day. The new one on the block is love jihad. Basically, this story, this narrative that's being fleshed out and put out is almost similar to a narrative that was being put out in the 80s and 90s, which said that the Muslims multiply so fast, they're allowed to have 4 wives, they're soon going to outnumber all the Hindus in India. So that drove some of the anti-Muslim actions to a large part in the northern part of India. Today's narrative is love jihad. Watch out for Muslim girls. They're here to entrap you, the Hindu guys, convert them to terrorists, to convert them to Islamic terrorists. And, one could laugh this off and think, it's just some perverted, sick mind at work. But here's the problem. The problem is large provinces in the north, they are now beginning to, part of the constitution is already being rewritten. The fact that they introduced something called the Citizenship Amendment Act against the Muslims. They revoked the autonomy statute of Kashmir, again, exposing those Muslims to even more horrors than they have already been facing. Now you're talking about at least 3 provinces in the north as of last week who have decided, and there might be a few more joining them, to enact laws against intercultural marriages. A Hindu can't marry a Muslim. So the idea is beware of all these Muslim girls. They are jihadists. They're going to marry, they're going to, entice Hindu guys away and make them terrorists. Last couple of slides, I know I'm running out of time, but this is essentially to show you what's happening in India today as we speak. And when this refers to the world's largest democracy, if you look at the loss of autonomous status in Kashmir, the controversial citizen register, the internet shutdowns, freedom of expression, anybody who opposes to what's happening in the country now is either killed in some cases, or they're jailed. And you can be 87-year-old activist, but you're still jailed. So the point here I'm trying to make is when you have the head of state basically mirroring what any of us could clearly see are symbols of Nazism or fascism, and then who doesn't raise his voice or even put a halt to everything that's happening in the country, it's very clear that there is implicit approval to this kind of anti-minority activities and extremism that's being conducted as we speak today. So I'll conclude with this slide. The point is, here you are talking about, you're bringing in Hindu extremism or Hindu fundamentalism, if you want to call it that, to reshape the country in your idea of what India should look like, what you imagined, what you perceived India was. And in the process, there's the burning and the breaking. And the question is, the whole notion of a country like India stands to lose a lot if this persists, if this continues. And the real worry for a number of us is the very willingness, the very easy transformation of people, an average person, into this kind of ideology. So people whom we have known for decades, they're coming out of the woodwork. And I think the point is it's an idea that's obviously dormant in a large number of people, and a leadership like this has been able to tap and mobilize. Now, I think that is the real question for us. Is extremism, to a good extent, the ideas of extremism? Now, I've spoken about people who are going out and doing things, but what about people like you and me who buy into these ideas? Does that make us extremists? That does make us equally culpable. And so I'll end here and take questions when the time comes. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Takwani. We will now move on to our third and last speaker, Dr. Sam Mullins, who is a professor at the Daniel K. Inouye Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies in Hawaii. He has been researching and teaching terrorism, counterterrorism, and countering violent extremism for more than a decade, and has presented his work to various security agencies, including the FBI, NYPD, the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, the Australian Federal Police, NATO, and the Indonesian National Armed Forces. He is also an honorary fellow at the University of Wollongong in Australia. His most recent book is Jihadist Infiltration of Migrant Flows to Europe. Dr. Mullins will be speaking on white supremacist extremism. Dr. Mullins, over to you.
Fantastic, thank you. Let me say, first of all, just a big thank you to Professor Ramakrishna and to the ICPVTR for the opportunity to be part of this really interesting panel. We're going to talk about something, really quite different now in terms of what we see superficially on the surface. We're talking about right-wing violent extremism and terrorism, which takes place primarily, of course, in North America, in Europe, in Australia, and as we've seen, of course, most devastatingly and recently in New Zealand. But although at first glance this is very different, you'll actually find a lot of fundamental similarities between this form of extremism and what we have just been talking about. All of the 7 kind of key features of extremists, which Professor Ramakrishna talked about, all of those can be seen here. It is very much a feeling amongst these individuals that their sense of identity is under attack or is under siege. And they absolutely have a form of identity supremacism, where you see these very strong kind of in-group and out-group dynamics. But as Professor Takwani just talked about just recently as well in relation to Hindu extremism, a lot of this is primarily expressed in terms of civilization, in terms of race, and in terms of culture. So without further ado, we'll kind of jump into this. And I just want to quickly warn everybody, most of the photographs and things that you're going to see those are right-wing extremist propaganda taken from Telegram and other platforms that they use. So some of it may be offensive in nature, but I just wanted to highlight that up front. Okay. So I'm going to talk a bit more about the beliefs and the identity of these groups and individuals, the extent to which this is a growing problem, and we'll talk a bit also about the impact of the pandemic, and then just hopefully a few words about the potential outlook of this. So the first thing to recognize or to realize in relation to right-wing extremism and terrorism, first of all, I am focused primarily on groups and individuals who are either advocating for violence, that kind of dangerous speech, which was mentioned earlier, through much of the kind of images and symbols that you see here on the screen, or individuals who are actively plotting and conducting those acts of violence as well. So the second key thing to realize is really the diversity that we see within the right wing. You know, we tend to think of right wing, it's white supremacists, it's neo-Nazis, and that's certainly a part of it, quite a big part of it. But there was tremendous diversity within the right wing as well. I personally think that there are three kind of particularly prevalent kind of strands of thought or belief which run through this movement. Specifically, those are white supremacy, secondly, anti-government sentiment, and thirdly, anti-Semitism, which is really rife throughout the movement. But in addition to those three kind of strands, you have a whole range of a diverse range of other beliefs and issues which individuals and groups focus on. And you can subscribe to one or another. You don't necessarily subscribe to all of these within the movement. But let me talk a little bit more about each of these in turn. So when it comes to sort of white supremacy, some of the individuals here, of course, subscribe specifically to neo-Nazi beliefs, and that's reflected in their imagery, in the symbols they use, the individuals that they refer to, and where they draw their sort of ideological influence. But others are really just focused on the issue of racial superiority without necessarily referencing that Nazi ideology. I would actually say that one of the most prevalent kind of beliefs that right now within the right wing is this belief in what they call the Great Replacement. And this was actually the title, if you remember, of the manifesto left behind by Brenton Tarrant, who was the terrorist who attacked and killed 51 worshippers in mosques in New Zealand in 2019. And it's summarized in this meme that you see on the top left there, where they say demographic replacement is white genocide. And so what they believe is that immigration coming into Europe, into North America, Australia, New Zealand, they believe that this is actually replacing and eroding and destroying the white race in total, including its culture, its heritage, and everything about it. And actually, this was something that Sham had mentioned in his speech as well. You know, this idea that Muslims in particular, but also other immigrants, kind of having more babies or reproducing, and because of that, they're outnumbering the host population. So this is what they're really focused on. And this really drives them towards hating just about anybody who is not a straight white male. So I mean, they really are against most other groups and individuals. Second to that, which is often combined but not necessarily, is this anti-government sentiment. One of the core kind of sort of beliefs or themes which we see in this particular part of the movement is what they themselves refer to as accelerationism. And that is, again, summarized in this meme in the center here, which is produced by a neo-Nazi organization in the United States called The Base, which some of you will, of course, will know that kind of is almost a kind of a tip of the hat to Al-Qaeda. But they summarize this belief here, where so they say this civilization is collapsing, let's give it a push. So they believe that liberal democracy, liberal democratic governments have failed or are failing and falling apart. And what they want to do is speed that process up through acts of terrorism so that they can reconstruct a new form of society. Now, for your neo-Nazis, of course, then they want a Nazi-based National Socialist order. For others who are anti-government but not necessarily racist or neo-Nazi, they seem to want a sort of what is usually a vaguely defined form of libertarian government, so minimalist intervention from government, and of course no taxes. So interestingly enough, you know, to give you a sense of some of the diversity that we see here and how complicated it can be, a good example is the Boogaloo movement right now in the United States. They are often characterized as sort of white supremacists and racist, but in reality, they are primarily anti-government and anti-left wing. But we've also seen them being very pragmatic, for instance, siding with the Black Lives Matter protests because of their anti-police stance. So they're quite kind of flexible in some degrees. And there is a lot of diversity even within that sort of sub-movement. The third element, though, that I want to highlight here that is particularly prevalent amongst the right wing is anti-Semitism. And this is really at the core of a lot of the conspiratorial thinking within this movement. So, for instance, your white supremacists generally hold some kind of secret Jewish cabal as being responsible for this great replacement that they talk about. And just about any other issue that you can think of, they generally blame the Jews, as well as the government or other individuals. And this particular meme that you see here, I just pulled this from Telegram today, and what you can see is Biden and Trump. And what they're showing with this is that they're both being controlled by this secret Jewish kind of conspiracy. So to them, it really doesn't matter which particular figure is in charge. So those are the kind of three main themes. And as I say, you don't have to subscribe to all three. We see a lot of variety there, but those are, I think, are three of the most prevalent strands of thought that we see. Something else that we see, and this is depicted in the bottom left picture here, is a lot of misogyny and hatred of women, sometimes really quite shocking. And that is really kind of shown most clearly in what is now referred to as the incel movement, so which is short for involuntarily celibate. So these are primarily young men who are sexually unsuccessful, who are very bitter about that and therefore want to attack both women and men who are in relationships as well. This individual you see here is Elliot Rodger, who committed an incel-inspired terrorist attack in 2014, killing several people. And the other thing that you'll notice about this particular picture is the Christian iconography. And first of all, we do see Christianity, references to Christianity kind of peppered throughout the right wing. It isn't quite as prevalent, certainly, as their references to race and ethnicity, but it is a feature of the movement as well. And certainly those individuals who conduct attacks like Roger and others, Tarrant and Breivik and people like that, are depicted as martyrs and as saints. And that is, again, a way of revering them and also encouraging others to go down a similar path. Something else that we see in the movement, of course, being that it is right-wing, is strong anti-left-wing sentiment. And that's captured in this meme here. And again, we talked about dangerous speech and whether or not it's clearly inciting violence. Well, this depicts somebody running over and killing an Antifa activist at a protest. And a lot of what they actually do is kind of questions and jokes and insinuation rather than outright saying go out and do a terrorist attack. Within the United States, another real kind of influential part of this is the pro-gun culture. And if you can read that there, that picture in the center, it says the only diversity we need. So we have a picture of all these different guns and weapons, and they're also referencing, of course, the anti-immigrant sentiment in this particular meme. And so that certainly feeds into it. And for instance, that's a big part of the Boogaloo movement as well. Something that's a little bit more unexpected is a combination of neo-Nazi beliefs with environmental concerns. And you see that reflected in what's now called eco-fascism. And that seems to be a kind of a growing kind of movement within the right wing as well. And then in addition to that, you have some more kind of unexpected or random sorts of things, which perhaps you wouldn't have expected. But far right is the logo or the symbol for a group called the Order of the Nine Angels, which is essentially a Satanist / right-wing organization, which has been influential amongst some of the neo-Nazi groups that exist in the United States, for instance. In addition to all of that, it's really worth mentioning this is a heavily online culture, and there was a lot of gaming culture and language and memes and so on, which is prevalent throughout the movement as well. So very, very diverse, a lot of different groups and individuals, but this at least gives you some sense of some of the kind of beliefs that they hold and the sense of identity that some of these individuals and groups have. Why are we talking about this? Well, it is a growing problem. Some of the statistics you will see actually show a pretty steep increase in these types of attacks taking place in recent years. It all depends on your data. We've been pretty poor, I think, historically and even today at keeping track of all of the right-wing motivated violence that takes place. Some of the more detailed graphs, as you see depicted on the left there, actually suggest that fatal right-wing attacks were even higher during the 1990s. But the key thing to recognize is that certainly we've seen an increase in high-profile mass casualty attacks, like in Norway, like in New Zealand, like in the United States and other parts in Europe and so on as well. We've also seen an increase in international connections between these groups, and that is a deliberate tactic of them, and it's of course facilitated by the internet. In the center there, what you can see is the logo for a group called the Russian Imperial Movement. And they've really been quite instrumental in facilitating some of these connections, in bringing people to paramilitary camps in Russia, bringing them to right-wing conferences and things of that nature, and also sending people to take part in conflict in places like Ukraine and Libya. Now, if we ask ourselves, why is this taking place? Some of the structural kind of factors, the facilitating factors that are probably contributing to this are things like the growth in right-wing populist politics in the legitimate political realm, which kind of creates a more conducive atmosphere for some of these groups to be able to thrive. Economic downturns can also be contributing. I do have to stress, though, that in both of those cases, it's rather like trying to find the root causes of terrorism. And so when we look at to try and find a statistical correlation between these factors and right-wing violence, that is often very weak or even an absent correlation. So we think that they're contributing, but it's actually hard to find that connection when it comes to research. Some of the things which are certainly directly driving it in terms of the individual level of motivation are things like the increase in immigration that we've seen in Europe and North America, as well as actually some of the attacks which have taken place which were inspired by ISIS or Al-Qaeda. Then the final thing to note here is the attacks themselves are actually very influential for driving the movement forward as well. Bottom right is some of those that we've seen recently where there was a manifesto left behind, and that tends to add very significantly to the influence of the attack, as well as now what we've seen, of course, since Christchurch in particular, has been the implementation of live streaming of these attacks as well. So the attacks themselves create a certain momentum and are designed to do that as well. Let me just say a few words also about, the impact of the pandemic. One of the things which is immediately obvious is that, some of the conditions of the pandemic lend themselves very well to some of the right-wing narratives and kind of reinforce some of the existing conspiracies and things that they have. So, for instance, it's been a lot of the conspiracies around this are basically, again, blaming the Jews, blaming left-wing individuals, blaming the government, either for manufacturing the virus or for deliberately spreading it somehow. And so they use this to kind of feed into some of their existing narratives that they already had and to try and strengthen the movement that way. Of course, it also feeds into immigration and anti-Asian sentiment and anti-Chinese in particular. So we've seen a big uptick in propaganda aimed at capitalizing on this situation. Top left is one example of that, where they're basically encouraging violence, as you see in the picture there, against the government for lockdown measures that have been introduced. In addition to that, we have seen right-wing individuals basically attempted to co-opt some of the protests that have been taking place in opposition to lockdown measures. That's one example at the top right there. And we have also seen a small number, I have to say, of plots and attacks which are directly motivated or linked to the pandemic in some way. Bottom left is the relatively recent arrest of a number of individuals who were plotting to kidnap and execute the governor of Michigan because of the lockdown measures that she had introduced. And so we have seen some individuals being deliberately moved towards violence in reaction to this. We also see the encouragement in some cases of actual bioterrorism. So telling individuals essentially, if you get infected, go out and deliberately target your local mosque, your local synagogue, your immigrant communities and so on, and go and infect them. Luckily, of course, we haven't seen that materialize. And when it comes to things like bioterrorism, the intent is often very high, but the capability is lacking. So certainly all of this added up, you can say, has energized the far right when it comes to violent extremism. It is worth noting, though, they've also experienced a lot of setbacks and limitations. So despite all of the increase in propaganda, the data that we currently have actually really don't indicate that there has necessarily been a particular significant increase in the number of people who are being radicalized or the number of people who are actually conducting violent attacks. From the data I've seen, it's actually pretty consistent with previous years in terms of the levels of activity. And there's really only about half a dozen or so cases where we can tie it directly to the pandemic. More importantly as well, I think that they've had to cancel a number of things like music, conferences, mixed martial arts tournaments, music festivals and things of that nature, which would normally allow them to network and get together and raise funds and things like that. And so they've had to cancel a lot of that. Perhaps most importantly of all, though, they have flown a little bit too close to the sun, in my opinion, and now getting burned. And what I mean by that is that they have attracted a lot of attention to themselves, and we're now seeing more of a crackdown, both from social media companies, which are operating their online space, and now also from law enforcement in a number of countries. So if we just kind of quickly wrap it up, yes, in terms of risk factors, looking ahead, there are reasons certainly to be concerned. They are currently energized. Society is polarized, particularly still in the United States. The grievances that they have are still there for them to take advantage of. And they have arguably perhaps increased their support base during the last year or so. And I have to add that the Black Lives Matter protests have also fed into this, and they've certainly tried to take advantage of that. On the plus side, the movement as a whole is still very much disorganized and decentralized. They lack space and territory to be able to operate and build up their capacity. They are increasingly restricted both on and offline. And historically, they have displayed pretty poor operational security, meaning that they're relatively easy to infiltrate and to prevent from acting in terms of violence. So that is the kind of outlook. What I will say is this: we will definitely see more lone actor acts of right-wing terrorism, absolutely, who emerge from this movement. But I'll be very surprised if they significantly increase their organizational capacity because of the reasons that I've just mentioned. So that is it in terms of my remarks, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And thank you to all the speakers. That was very informative talks, each one of you. I want to encourage the audience to please send some questions in the text box. I don't see any questions yet. So what I will do is I will take the liberty to ask the questions, one question of each speaker, since as a moderator, I have that opportunity. So to Dr. Ramakrishna, I have one question for each, if I may. Dr. Ramakrishna, what does it really mean? You'd mentioned that you'd mentioned religious extremism as a reaction to a view that your religion is under siege. So my question to you is, what does it really mean to understand that your religion is under siege? To Professor Takwani, you'd mentioned that the RSS in India, Hinduism as religion isn't really the crux of it, it's not really the essence, it's just a vehicle, which I absolutely agree with. You'd mentioned that the essence is more racial, ethnic, and linguistic identities. So my question to you is, would you, I would imagine, and I want to know if you would think that too, would you then conceptualize it more as a struggle for recognition, in the sort of Hegelian struggle for recognition, as wanting to be seen as not so much equal but different, but superior and different? And to Dr. Mullins, my question is, Judith Butler, when she analyzes white supremacists in the United States, she argues that white supremacists are pro-Zionist but anti-Semitic, so pro-Zionist but anti-Jewish. And I wanted to know what your view on that is. So in her, Judith Butler's view, they're pro-Zionist in the sense that they want the state of Israel to not only exist, but to expand its borders, but they're anti-Jewish in that they ultimately want the Jews, American Jews, who are American, to essentially, quote, leave the country and go back home to Israel. So I wanted to know what your views are. So Dr. Ramakrishna, may I ask you first to address the question?
Sure, thanks, Iram. Great question. When we talk about religious extremism as a response to religion under siege, let me just go back to what I was saying in the presentation. I consider religious extremism to be an acute form of religious fundamentalism. And it is the fundamentalists in the religion who feel that the religion is under siege. What do we mean by under siege? There can be various indicators, for example, conversions out of the religion to another religion. So the religious leaders who are fundamentalists, and from the fundamentalists, I suggest you get the extremists, right? The fundamentalist leaders feel that, you know, the number of religious adherents is getting less and less because of conversions to a more perceived successful religion. In terms of demographics, in fact, one thing I noticed across all the three presentations, one key thing that seems to pop up is that whether you're talking about Buddhist extremists or the Hindu extremists or some of the white supremacist extremists, there is a common concern about demographics, that, you know, through immigration or various other natural causes, the in-group is going to be eventually replaced by a perceived more powerful religious out-group. So the demographic sense of falling fertility rates of the in-group relative to the out-group. And as a result of all these trends, ultimately the perception that the status of the religious group in the wider society is coming down, you know. So as a fundamentalist, there are various ways to respond. One way could be to form a political party, right, or an interest group, right, and pressure the government of the day to do more to improve the status and conditions of living for the religious in-group, right, or even pass discriminatory legislation against a perceived dangerous out-group. And some extremists from there would go even further and engage in violence against the out-group. So ultimately, these are ways in which the general perception that one's religious group tent, I mean, some scholars talk about a group tent, is under siege, may eventually down the road be a factor that contributes to out-group violence. Thanks.
Yeah, I agree with you, Aaron. It's primarily the way they go on about it when the RSS, when it was conceived, they were talking more about protecting and preserving the purity of the Hindu race. And at that point in time, one of the similarities and one of the reasons why they adore, even today, why they adore someone like good old Adolf Hitler is because of, you talk about the purity of the race, and both of them shared the belief in being the Aryan race and so on and so forth. So for them, it's purity of the race. And today, as we see it, that is a major driving factor, purity of the race. It even extends to, I didn't have time to talk about this earlier, but it even extends to being anti-West. They love the economic benefits of partnering with the West, but what they can't tolerate are the cultural and social shifts in society. I keep coming back to misogyny. I keep coming back to the girl situation. They just can't take it. I mean, the fact that a girl can have a mind of her own, or she can go to the pub and guys, or she can smoke or wear jeans or travel on her own, that's anathema. I mean, for them, that is breakdown of society. For them, that is that's the ultimate form of pollution of the pure Hindu race. And it's always about maintaining, preserving, and again, let me reiterate, this is an imaginary world in which we live. Because if you go back to history, it's utterly, you don't find traces of most of what they aspire for in any of the history books. Mythology is different. So for them, they always hark back. This is how it was in the Ramayana. This is how it was then. This is how a woman's role was. This is what her role was. For them, it's trying to fit their society into their imaginary notion of a pure race, ultimately. And it's just convenient that occasionally they'll use different props. Like once upon a time, 20, 30, 40 years ago, it was, oh, the Muslims are going to outnumber us because they multiply fast. And so, and that had traction for a while, but after a while, it lost traction. So now it's love jihad, and tomorrow it's going to be something else. Yeah.
Thank you. Dr. Mullins?
Sure, yeah. So I have to admit, I'm not familiar with Butler's work on the white supremacist movement in reference to whether or not they are pro-Zionist, but at the same time anti-Semitic. So I can only comment to what I have seen, which is they are just vehemently anti-Semitic. You know, you may have come across this acronym ZOG, ZOG. So that's the Zionist occupied government, which they often refer to. You know, it's the idea that the US government and others are being controlled by this secret Jewish conspiracy, which I talked about. At the same time, I could certainly see it being something which some individuals would subscribe to. And the reason I say that is it comes back to something that Sham said there about it all comes back to purity. You know, as you described, if they're basically not in our country, and as long as they're in their own country, then it's not viewed as a problem. So I could see more pragmatic individuals subscribing to that. I just personally
I'll get water.
Seen it myself.
Oh, okay, get it from there.
Just one thing I'll kind of add real quick to that would be, you know, there are sometimes these unexpected sort of beliefs or trends. For instance, a lot of the white supremacists, neo-Nazis and so on, actually look to Japan as a model society because it's relatively homogenous compared to most others. And so they hate anybody who's not white, but they can still look up to them, admire them. The other interesting thing is to see a lot of admiration of jihadists or terrorist people like bin Laden and others, even within the right wing. So it can be very eclectic and quite unexpected, as you described.
Hey, thank you very much. All right, so we have a number of questions from the audience. So I'll start with one for Professor Ramakrishna. An audience member wonders whether the 7 characteristics that you mentioned also apply to Malaysia's PAS party or not, and to what extent?
Answer now?
Yes, yes.
Okay, right. Thanks very much. And, thanks for the question. You know, the 7 characteristics which I mentioned, the identity supremacism, in-group bias, out-group prejudice, obsession with purity, low integrative complexity, i.e. leading to dualistic us and them thinking, dangerous speech, soft mode, hard mode, and the quest for power. These are 7 discrete characteristics. So as I mentioned in the presentation, all 7 characteristics have to be there before I would, as an analyst, would consider an entity as extremist. So looking at political parties, like PAS is an Islamist political party, in your example, I wouldn't call it extremist because I don't see all the 7 characteristics. So sure, there is, of course, there's a quest for power, perhaps there's this identity supremacism, but there's no dangerous speech. I mean, I need to see empirical evidence that, you know, somebody in PAS actually engages in dangerous speech. So That's why when I talk about the 7 characteristics, all have to be present before I would consider, analyzing them as extremists. So I would suggest caution in the terminology application. Thanks.
Thank you very much. There are two questions for Professor Takwani. One of them is from the audience. One of them is, what do Hindutva movement feel about the Indian diaspora? And the second related question is, do you see the RSS as turning away from the BJP?
Okay, I'll take the second one first. RSS turning away from the BJP, it's never going to happen. Never going to happen. Matter of fact, RSS is going to make sure that they work in consort. The RSS also recognizes that it can't afford to be, not that it can't afford, but it would be preferable not to be seen operating in the front lines. They're better off operating in the shadows, and the BJP is their political vehicle to push forward their dream, their agenda, their goal, their aspiration. So the RSS is never going to break away from the BJP. It just cannot do that because at last, after 70 odd years, they are in power. And their main task is going to be sure to ensure that the BJP executes, they have this blueprint and we got to get there. Now, how we're going to get there, we'll do it together. So that's the answer to that. As for the diaspora, the fact that they expend so much of resources on the diaspora overseas, even for instance, we saw a couple of events we had in the US when Modi came to visit the US. He got the rockstar treatment. Now all that funding is obviously from the diaspora itself. So the way they would see the diaspora is twofold. Clearly, one is to be megaphones to India's greatness. And when they speak about India's greatness, how India is great as an economic power, how it's a go-to country for anything you want, and so on and so forth. Essentially, whether it is talking about investments, whether it's talking about political power, whether it's trying to make sure that there's international support for dealing with Pakistan or China, for instance, we talk about geopolitical issues. So the diaspora clearly functions as a mouthpiece and a megaphone. That's one. Number two, the fact that they're able to be the publicity organization for the BJP or for the RSS, it also ensures that they can raise a tremendous amount of funds for events like the ones I just mentioned. And even come election time, it's always good to have some dollars in your kitty when you need to, like we just saw the election yesterday in Bihar. So I would say, and the third one I should have mentioned, there was an effort in some of the universities on the West Coast to recraft the syllabus in a history lesson for the history textbook. And part of it had to do with labeling the RSS for what it is and the rise of the RSS. You won't believe this, but there was so much of pressure put by the diaspora on the university to scrap that proposal. Unfortunately, I haven't tracked it last week to see what's happened, what the outcome is, but I won't be surprised if the diaspora is successful in getting the university in the United States to withdraw from its efforts to correct history textbooks.
Interesting, thank you. There's one question for Dr. Mullins from the audience. Question is, what's the likelihood of violent reaction in European countries to the Muslim, immigration or Muslim refugees?
Sure, yeah. I mean, just briefly on that, I mean, we've already seen it. So I think it does depend on the sort of the nature of the political events that are actually taking place, the way that they happen. So for instance, demographic changes are very slow burn and there's no particular kind of event which kind of acts as a trigger. Whereas when we saw the immigration influx into Europe in 2015 and it really hit those peaks, it was quite a dramatic sort of event. And then you had a variety of other things that were connected to that, various kind of scandals, whether it was acts of terrorism, but actually more common were kind of acts, criminal activities and so on that happen to be committed by migrants. And those sorts of things are, I think, are much more influential in kind of motivating people to actually kind of do something, to push past that kind of barrier towards doing violent acts. So the likelihood of it, I think that, it's hard to make those kind of long-term predictions, but the likelihood is, yes, we will continue to see the same type of violence, I think, that we're seeing now. But the real question, I think, will be what kind of sparks, what kind of key events might take place that would actually lead to increases in violence. For those of you who asked, some of the other stuff about the kind of ship posting and things like that, I'm happy to take those questions as well in a minute.
Actually, there is a question related to that. And the question is, how do you assess the threat of right-wing extremism, since they are mainly online, and being online with offensive images and memes, could that just be a catharsis that's enough? Or do you really imagine that, do you project that it's going to be, there's an actual threat, a physical threat, more as much as it's presented?
So yeah, I mean, basically, again, there is a threat for sure. I mean, we've seen that. We've seen people who have already conducted acts of violence, and we've seen numerous plots and so on being disrupted by law enforcement. So the threat is certainly there. The question, of course, I think which somebody kind of got at there is, how do you distinguish that? How do you tell who's really the real threat there? And the important thing to recognize is a lot of their communications, their memes, their jokes, and all those things, those are really designed specifically with law enforcement and potential criminal activities in mind. It gives them a sort of a plausible deniability, if you like. And of course, it varies on the legal system. But for instance, in the United States, we have very strong protections of freedom of speech. It makes it particularly difficult to go after people who are just saying things, but then aren't actually necessarily following through with it personally. So the challenge there is very, very difficult. All I would say personally, and this is kind of thinking off the top of my head to some degree, but I think is we've got to match up the online with the offline. It's kind of looking at the activities, the behavior, the associations, the connections of the people that we flag online, and matching it up with what they're doing offline, and that might help to some degree. The big challenge, though, just very briefly, is that especially in the right wing, most of the attacks that we have seen have been ultimately perpetrated by lone individuals. And although they do have varying connections to broader networks, which are an opportunity for us, it does make it very difficult to detect and to prevent those individuals from acting in advance. And the key to preventing lone actor terrorism is really looking at some of what we call leakage, where they basically tell other associates and people what they're actually planning on doing, and that's really your key piece of your key opportunity to get intelligence ahead of time.
Okay, thank you very much. So we're getting close to the end, but I want to take 2 or 3 more questions. So another question is for Professor Takwani. The question is, Indian diaspora in the United States tends to vote Democratic, but at home they support BJP and Modi. Can you comment on that?
Well, for one, I'm not very certain that's a factual, that they tend to vote more for Democrats than for Republicans. But if that were true, I think the answer is obvious. The Democrats would give you more H-1B visas that Republicans aren't. I mean, I'm trying to be facetious here, but I think a part of the answer is that the fact that it looks like it's easier to ensure that what we just saw in the last 4 years from the United States and India's relations, particularly when it comes to issues of visas and exchanges, that's been hard on a large number of Indians. And I think if they did vote for Democrats this time more than they did in the past, then I think part of the answer is that they stand to gain more with Democrats than with the Republicans.
Thank you. Interesting. There's a question for Professor Ramakrishna. Question is that, is Hindu extremism a concern in Singapore? Based on what Professor Takwani has outlined, Would you say that Singaporeans of Indian descent are they likely to prescribe to this kind of a exclusionary attitude toward Muslims and others?
Well, first of all, I would say that any kind of religious extremism would be of concern in a small multicultural country like Singapore. Going to the specific issue of Hindu extremism, I don't see it. In fact, there's a very good report. It was published by RSIS, Center of Excellence for National Security, recently that actually looked at Hindu fundamentalism and in Singapore, and the report essentially indicated that there was no concern of Hindu fundamentalism or for that matter extremism in Singapore for the moment. But one would, the report also, and I would agree, the authors, Norman Vasu and Terry Anteo, that one should not be complacent because Singapore is a very globalized country, as we know. I mean, we are very much linked in with the wider global ideological current, so one must not be complacent. But currently, we do not have, I don't see this problem in Singapore. Yep. Thanks.
Thank you very much. There's another question for Dr. Mullins. Question is that given that Donald Trump has been voted out, do you imagine or do you forecast that the white supremacists will get more agitated now that they don't have a person in the White House that can tacitly support them? Or do you think they'll just phase out given the fact that they don't have the tacit support in the White House?
So yeah, I mean, it's a great question. It would seem as if over the last few years that they have increased in their kind of boldness and in their activities, certainly in some of the things, you know, the online activities and things that they're promoting. You are certainly seeing some individuals react very strongly to what's happening right now in the United States with the change of administration. And so in the short term, I would think that we certainly have an increased risk of violence, but that would be basically across the political spectrum right now in the United States. Over time, I think it partly depends on what else is happening, to be frank. We are seeing, I think, increasing willingness and signs of US law enforcement to monitor and to prohibit the activities of these groups and individuals more robustly, perhaps, than they have in the past. You know, the Russian imperial movement is one example where they've actually designated a right-wing organization as a terrorist organization for the first time. And I think although the domestic situation is more complicated, we're seeing growing calls, for instance, to come up with real domestic terrorism legislation that would allow them to go after some of these groups more effectively than they have. So it's kind of, we're seeing things moving in different directions. It's very, very difficult to predict over the long term. In the short term, I think it is certainly a concern for violence right now.
Thank you. So you don't see the long term, you see more a short term. So you see less of such violence when Biden takes over?
Again, I think it depends on the nature of that transition, which we're still kind of, you know, working through, and we're not quite sure what's going to happen there. So the nature of the transition itself will have an impact. Again, the law enforcement activities will have an impact. And then not to mention all these other kind of conflating factors that we're seeing combined, you know, the pandemic, Black Lives Matter protests, all these things combined. I do apologize for leaving my crystal ball at home, although I am at home, but I don't have it with me. So I really couldn't, I wouldn't want to make a kind of a wild kind of prediction, other than to say that the transition phase itself, you know, the next, certainly I would say 6 to 12 months, I think is a particularly dangerous period.
All right, thank you. So I think I'm going to read another question. I think that can be for each one of you. Perhaps you can answer. The question is that it seems that most Buddhist extremists, Hindu extremists, and white supremacists tend to demonize the Muslims or tend to be targeted against Muslims. Should this mean they should be more effective at countering Islamophobia policies in Singapore, in India, in the United States and Australia? Do you think that that's going to be the resolution to this focus on Islamophobia. So I think perhaps if each one of the speakers can say something about that, and then we'll wrap up the talk.
Okay, I'll start. Yep. Okay, thanks. Right, I do believe that certainly Islamophobia, I would agree, is a serious concern globally. And any attempt to sort of, by stakeholders, government agencies, civil society organizations, not just, not just Muslim grassroots leaders, but also the non-Muslim grassroots and community leaders coming out to form a united front against Islamophobic sentiment is very, very important to sort of contribute to the overall attempt to create a norm against Islamophobia. Having said that, it's not just Muslims that are, targeted. In this particular case, we have seen, Buddhist extremism in Myanmar and certainly Hindu extremism in India. It can also be other groups. Could be the Jews. It could be Hispanics in North America. Could be Asians as well. So the identity of the out group sort of shifts from context to context. So we have to keep in mind that any kind of out group phobia is bad and should be sort of dealt with by the various relevant stakeholders. Thanks.
Thank you.
All right. In the case of India, what do you do when the state itself is tacitly approving this kind of behavior or this Islamophobia? The state is encouraging it. When the state itself is doing it, yes, you have then again, it's not just about Muslims, it's against lower castes, against dissenters, but primarily Muslims, that's 200 million. Your options are limited on how do you counter that kind of Islamophobia. Civil rights groups, they continue doing what they can. Individuals, especially high-flying individuals, try, but it's not very difficult to shut them down, especially if they have huge stakes in the country. I'll give you a simple example. When you have the biggest of the biggest Bollywood stars coming out to say the country is going through a rough patch, he shouted out. I mean, the fact is, go to Pakistan is, it's a very reflexive kind of response that these guys come up with. He happens to be Muslim, but there's a greater danger. There's danger to his family, there's danger to his career, and so on and so forth. So they get very innovative in trying to find ways to silence dissenters or to even silence civil rights activists. In a case like this, when the state itself is complicit in this kind of behavior, there's only, I think there's only hope from the international community. Now, it's one thing to say we don't want to meddle in the internal affairs of another country, but that's hogwash. You can't be selective. You can't say I'm going to interfere in this country and not in that country because that country is more of strategic importance to me in countering China or doing this and so on and so forth. So I think I'm going on and on, but the point is when a state is complicit in this kind of Islamophobic behavior and civil activists have very little wiggle room, it's incumbent, I think, on external players to be able to some degree influence this anti-Islamic tendency.
And I'll just keep my remarks really brief because I think, both of my co-panelists here have kind of already said most of what needs to be said. But I do think that, as a general goal for society, we need to, tackle all forms of phobias and in-group, out-group discrimination and racism and all these things that we've been talking about, which of course are leading some individuals towards acts of violence. But that's just a general goal for your society as a whole. What I would say is that we also need to be careful not to kind of inflate the role of extremists in our societies, that this is what we're focused on, this is what we're talking about. And it kind of, in some ways, it clouds your judgment and your view of what's happening in society. In reality, we're talking about a very, very small number of people who are very noisy and have an outsized impact because of the violence and things that they do. But I would prioritize dealing with the violent extremists first and foremost. Somebody else asked, I think, a question about, what would be one policy recommendation. I would say target the recruiters. focus on the individuals who are particularly influential, who are recruiting people. They may not be involved in acts of violence themselves, but they are consistently connected to these groups and individuals who do. Good examples, if we borrow real quickly from the kind of jihadist activity that we've seen in Europe, would be people like, historical now, but people like Anjem Chowdhury in the UK, for instance. And then we see similar individuals, for instance, on the right wing in the United States, people like James Mason and others. And so I would say, look, we've got to go after specific recruiters and individuals and try and shut those down and focus on the real promotion of violence as a sort of an anti-extremist kind of strategy.
Right, thank you. So I'm just going to sum up a couple of points just made recently by the speakers. I absolutely agree with Dr. Ramakrishna that outgroup really varies according to context, and I think that's important to keep in mind for governments when they're making policy. Professor Tekwani had mentioned rightly that the problem becomes exacerbated when the state is complicit and is tacitly supporting extremism. I guess in that way, Singapore is in a good place because the state doesn't do that. And India is in a precarious situation because if you have the guy in the office tacitly supporting. And Dr. Mullen's point that targeting recruiters, and I think that's a very important point because that's where the crux is. Of course, the difficulty would then be how do you do that? But certainly that's where the target is. And I might add a little 2 cents on my part that I think perhaps also paying too much attention to extremists, making them headlines, just sort of feeds into their desire for recognition. And I wonder if that just worsens the situation. I wonder if any of the speakers would want to say something to that before we finish this webinar.
Oh yes, that's my favorite. My favorite. What's the hobby horse? Bashing the media, and I think that is. I'm very, very, very glad you brought it up because that's one component in the security architecture of any country that's often either dismissed or ignored, which is the media. And I really think I'll take this opportunity to suggest that our next discussion, Kumar, should be on the role of media and how it impacts on what we are discussing today. Because you got me started, Iram, and I'm afraid you're not going to go home till dinner if I start off. But the point is, it's a very important topic which really deserves an exclusive discussion. And it's very hard for me to sum up and say, yes, we got to do this, do that. But yes, media is very, very, very critical. The publicity that we give them is both, I would say sometimes it's the cause, sometimes it's our bane. I'll stop there.
I would add to what Prof. Tekwani has said. I mean, one should also keep in mind that last year in May, we had the French president and the New Zealand Prime Minister inaugurating the Christchurch call, where there was a call on governments around the world and social media companies to collaborate to take extremist content offline. And this certainly is an important move to sort of create an environment in which extremist content and extremist recruiters, which Dr. Mullins was talking about, do not have are no longer given a platform to articulate those repugnant views of theirs, and also to promote other kinds of outgroup phobia, as we have talked about. So yes, I mean, I agree with Shyam. I mean, there's something we should look at seriously in terms of the role of social media, the role of the media more generally in collaborating with governments, civil society, and other relevant stakeholders in dealing with this problem of violent extremism and its precursors. So, yeah, thanks.
Dr. Mullins, would you like to say something on that?
In terms of the media, yeah, I think it's some of the stuff again was already touched on by my co-panelists here, but it's a really interesting one because there have been efforts in the past to kind of shut down or restrict some of the media attention that we give to terrorists. with kind of varying and fairly limited degrees of success, to be perfectly honest. You know, the UK did this back in the day with the IRA, where they banned them from kind of speaking on TV and so on. And so what the news media at the time did was they got actors to kind of say exactly what the IRA terrorists did in an Irish accent, which, you know, almost identical. So the media tends to find kind of ways around some of these efforts. We also saw, for instance, you know, New Zealand took this pretty hard stance of, you know, not naming the individual behind the attacks in Christchurch. And I do think that that's an admirable and a principled stance to make, but ultimately I don't think it really limited the amount of attention that he's gotten, and it certainly didn't stop other countries and other media outlets from sharing his name and his image, for instance. They have done a pretty good job, I think, though, of restricting the coverage of him as an individual since he's been incarcerated. And you can compare that to somebody like Anders Breivik in Norway, who I think has been on kind of featured a little bit more prominently. So yeah, absolutely, it's a problem. We've got to try and do something about it, but it's just very, very difficult to deal with.
Hey, thank you very much. I want to note that our Executive Deputy Chairman, Ambassador Ong, has congratulated all of you on what he says was a very useful webinar, and particularly the point about the key influences to target the recruiters. So that's from Ambassador Ong. And I would like, as the moderator, to thank Dr. Ramakrishna, Professor Tekwani, and Dr. Mullins for really, truly very fascinating talks. Each one of you really enjoyed it. And so thank you very much for sharing this, and I look forward to seeing all of you again. Thank you very much.